You can see this in the story of Cain and Abel. Abel is hardworking and everyone likes him and he makes the proper sacrifices, and so his life goes really well. And that's part of the reason that Cain hates him. And he's jealous and resentful. But worse than that, if you're around someone, if you're not doing very well, especially if that's your own fault, if you're not doing very well and you're around someone who's doing very well, it's very painful because the mere fact of their being judges you. And so it's very easy to want to destroy that ideal, so that you don't have to live with the terrible consequences of seeing it embodied in front of you. And so part of the reason that people want to tear things down is so that they don't have anything to contrast themselves against and to feel bad. And that's exactly what's happening here. The kids are destroying all of this culture, roughly speaking, because it judges them. The fact that it exists judges them. And I've often thought this about Michelangelo's statue of David, which is this heroic, so David was a shepherd, obviously, and it doesn't sound like much, but back in those times, being a shepherd was a big deal because there were lions and you had a slingshot, and so like you got to defend your sheep from lions with a slingshot. So you weren't exactly this like 19th century English guy dressed in a, you know, frilly blue suit. You were tough as a bloody, well, as someone who would go after a lion with a slingshot. It's no joke. Anyways, the statue is very heroic, and you know, you look at that and you think, well, that's the possibility of humankind, but by the same token, it's also what you're not. And so, as well as being an ideal, it's a judge, and every ideal is a judge. So, yes?
Going back to your example of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
So you're using that as an example to illustrate becoming bitter as a result of not being able to achieve
sure
status as a result
success
of,
even
success as a result of hard work. But in the example of Cain and Abel, like one was a shepherd and the other was a farmer, and the one who
one is, yes, that's right,
one who was a shepherd was the one who was favored.
Yes, that's right.
So was that a result of the hard work, or was that a result of
good question. The stories, well, that's a good question. Those stories are very, very complicated, and the story is very ambivalent about whether Cain is not rewarded because he makes bad sacrifices or because God's just in a bad mood. And I like that. If you read the story, I've read multiple translations of the story, and when Cain comes to God to complain, God basically tells him, look, buddy, before you go about criticizing the structure of reality, you should look to your own inadequacies. He says, sin crouches at your door like a predatory, sexually aroused animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you, and something has emerged as a consequence. So don't be bothering me about my creation before you look to yourself. So there's a very strong hint that the reason that God has not favored Cain's sacrifices is because they weren't of particularly good quality. So, but it is ambivalent in the story, and there is the shepherd versus farmer motif as well. And of course that motif runs through the entire corpus of stories to some degree, especially the shepherd motif. So it's only about a paragraph long, that whole story, and it packs all that into that tiny little amount of space. But the idea that Cain kills Abel to get rid of his ideal and also to punish God, roughly speaking, it's a brilliant story. I mean, these guys who go around shooting up high schools, or shooting up high schools in particular, but you know, they're definitely out for revenge, and what they're revenging themselves against or to who is not exactly clear. Anyway, so these kids are just tearing down this model home, tearing down Western civilization, I suppose is another way of looking at it, or just tearing down civilization, period. And Pinocchio's having a pretty good time. He's got his axe and he's looking a little malevolent there, and happy to be destroying things, which is of course a pretty simple thing to do. So there's that image that I told you about, the mandala. That's a flower in this image. And so what happens is that I think it's Lampwick throws a brick through it. And so what that means symbolically is the self is a symbol of your potential, among very many other things. But by engaging in this sort of impulsive, destructive activity, Lampwick and Pinocchio are making it impossible for them to further their development. And they're doing that to some degree consciously. You know, they basically say to hell with it and toss a brick through this highest ideal, the thing through which light shines. So also that harkens back to the star as well. So anyways, the coachman is paying attention to all this, and he's actually pretty happy about the fact that these boys are so involved in their stupid amusements that that they're not paying any attention to what's actually going on. And he calls these people out of the darkness, these creatures out of the darkness. So you get these black, you can hardly see them there, but they're black cloaked figures with glowing eyes, and they're shutting the door of the amusement park. And that's very interesting. It's an extraordinarily interesting happening. It's like, okay, so all of a sudden the amusement park is associated. We already know that the coachman is up to no good, but now he's got these minions that are faceless in some sense. They're clearly creatures of the night, and they're up to no good. And so you have the sense that the boys are being offered bread in circuses, roughly speaking, but there's a real reason for it. There's a manipulative reason for it. They're being enticed into a trap, and the doors are closed, and these underground beings are involved in the plot. And obviously the coachman understands this perfectly well. And so one of the ways to understand this is to think about what totalitarian states have to offer their populace and what they offer them. And this happened particularly as Rome declined, let's say. That's where the term bread and circuses originally came from, is that as the situation degenerates, then people have to be offered stupid amusements more and more frequently in order for them to ignore what's actually going on in the background. And, you know, a war can be that kind of stupid amusement. Anyways, later that night, the entire place is completely devastated, and all we see is the wreckage of everything that was there before. And again, the cricket has got separated from Pinocchio, and so he's trying to find him, and Pinocchio ends up in this bar that's shaped like an 8-ball. 8-ball is kind of the random ball in pool. And anyways, he's inside the 8-ball, and he's shooting pool with Lampwick, and that's just another indication of wasting his time, basically. And you can see in the forefront there's some cards for gambling, and so he's engaged in these sort of, you might say, pointless, hedonic pursuits, and he's enticing Pinocchio along the same route. And so he teaches him to smoke first. That doesn't go very well. So Pinocchio takes a huge drag on a cigar, and it just about kills him. And when Lampwick asks him how he likes it, he shakes his head and says, you know, that was really quite good, but he's so sick that he can hardly stand up, and he's hallucinating double balls on the pool table. And then the cricket shows up and stands on the 8-ball and kind of gives one of those declamatory speeches again, you know, because he still hasn't quite figured out that standing up proud and spouting off the rules isn't exactly the right way for the conscience to behave. And Lampwick picks him up by the scruff of the neck, roughly speaking, and first of all asks who he is. So obviously he's divorced from his own conscience, and then makes fun of Pinocchio for paying attention to this little bug. And that's kind of a nice indication of what happens in adolescence, you know, because of course as the children move away from their parents and into their groups, especially when the groups are misbehaving, often what happens is that the other members of the group will torture a person who isn't willing to try something dangerous or foolish by making fun of the fact that they're, you know, too attached to their conscience. And there's a positive element to that, because you should take some risks when you're a teenager and also later in life. And so if you won't take any risks, there's actually something wrong with you. But there's a negative element in that, well, you know, teenagers do all sorts of stupid things, and perhaps it's amazing that we all live through it, actually, as far as I'm concerned. And some people take extraordinary risks, and they don't make it through at all, or they end up in the permanently antisocial population, and then they're, you know, basically career criminals. 5% of the criminals commit 95% of the crimes. It's another Pareto distribution. So, anyways, Lampwick isn't going to listen to Pinocchio or to the cricket. He laughs at him with this kind of braying laugh, which is some foreshadowing, and the cricket gets all upset, puts his coat on backwards, and ends up dumped down a pool table hole and otherwise abused. And so he stomps on out of there. He tells Pinocchio that he can take care of himself, and he stomps on out of there. And so Pinocchio is left without the guidance of conscience, and the cricket is trying to figure out how to get off Pleasure Island. But he goes through the gates and he sees what's actually going on. And what's going on is that the coachman has this like slave boat down in the bowels of the island, and he's got all these black suited minions with the glowing eyes working for him, and they're rounding up what look like donkeys. And so they're beasts of burden, right? And so there's an idea here that if you pursue impulsive pleasure to the detriment of the development of your character, you're going to end up a beast of burden. You're going to end up a slave to a tyrant. And that's exactly right.